All right, everyone, we have a pretty important question to answer today. And it was made at a congressional hearing recently, I think November 20th, by one Jasmine Crockett, Democrat of Texas, a congresswoman, a young African American congresswoman. And she made a very important question, or she asked several questions. Uh, but first, some background of what this was about. The hearing had to do with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Jasmine Crockett was arguing on behalf of DEI practices and why they're so important. And at one point, very passionately, she declared, and here are the questions, and I quote, "You tell me which white man was dragged out of their homes. You tell me which one of them got dragged all the way across an ocean and told that you're going to go to work. We're going to steal your wives. We're going to rape your wives. That didn't happen. That is oppression." So those are her questions. So obviously there's an assumption behind her questions. The white man, to use her words, has never experienced what the black man has. He's never been dragged out of his house. He's never been forced to do work, labor, and his women folk have not been raped. Okay. And there's a logic to that. What she's ultimately saying is that you white people haven't experienced this. You don't know oppression, and oppression is such that the only way to get over it is through things like DEI. Because unless you've experienced it, you don't know how traumatizing it is. Of course, slavery didn't happen to any black person living in America today, of course, and no white person enslaved them. These are the ancestors of today's African Americans, and the ancestors of, or some of the ancestors of both groups, whites and blacks, were involved in this. But at any rate, according to her, because whites have not experienced this, they don't know how traumatic it was, and therefore they don't understand why DEI is important. All right. So as to her questions, I think we should give her an answer. You tell me which white man was dragged out of their homes and dragged all the way across an ocean, told they're going to go to work and we're going to steal your wives, etc., etc. All right, so before we begin, and needless to say, I think it's important to clarify something. Slavery is not just a white man on black man thing. Unfortunately, that's how it's apparently taught or understood today. Slavery is just something that happened when white men enslaved blacks from Africa and brought them to the United States, the transatlantic slave trade, etc., etc. Yeah, that did happen, and I believe that was very bad, but it's not the definition of slavery. Throughout history, I think every single race and ethnicity, if you want to use that word, has at one time or another been enslaved. Whites have enslaved whites, whites have enslaved blacks, blacks have enslaved blacks, blacks have enslaved whites, and every shade and color in between has enslaved each other and others. That's just history. Probably to Ms. Jasmine Crockett, it doesn't matter that whites enslaved whites, because probably in her mind, what makes slavery so bad is when one race enslaves another. So to that end, I'll give a few statistics concerning non-white slavery of whites, which I think apparently a lot of people, such as Ms. Crockett, are completely unaware of. So let's start with the Barbary enslavement. So the Muslims of North Africa, and we have records of this and it's well documented, between the 16th and 18th century, or even the 19th century really. And to give you the exact dates, I'm quoting from a professor, Robert Davis. He's a professor, I believe, emeritus at Ohio State, a historian. And I'm quoting him. He writes, between 1530 and 1780, there were almost certainly 1 million, and quite possibly as many as 1.25 million white European Christians enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary Coast. And I believe that's from his book with the title White Slaves, Black Masters, or Black Masters, White Slaves. And there's a lot more statistics in there. All right, that's just one. During the Tatar yoke, the Tatars are the Mongols who were Islamized and became Muslims and enslaved, again, to give you a rough estimate, between 1450 and 1780, approximately 3 million Slavs, Eastern Europeans, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, were enslaved and sold on the Crimean slave market. Okay, so, to answer her question, You tell me which white man was dragged out of their homes. Just based on those two examples, we're talking about 4.25 million whites who were enslaved by non-whites. Now, this is just really the tip of the iceberg. I can give you more stats and numbers, and we have numbers from specific years. So, for example, in 1438, Bartolomeo di Giuliano, an Italian Franciscan who was holed up in Constantinople during one of its many sieges, it still had not been conquered, it's 1438. He described all the slaves that were being, or the Europeans and the Christians who were being enslaved by the Turks during this time. So in 1438, that year alone, he talked about 300,000 Christians were enslaved and carried off in just a few days, that's his quote, from Hungary. And from Serbia and Transylvania that same year, 100,000 were led away in iron fetters tied to the backs of horses. Women and children were herded by dogs without any mercy or piety. If one of them slowed down, unable to walk further because of thirst or pain, oh good Jesus, she immediately ended her life there in torment, cut in half. So that's just a little description along with the numbers and the statistics. And again, you know, a lot of these numbers come from the modern era, which traditionally historians date to 1500 and after 1500. But if you look at the sources, both Muslim and Christian and in between, you'll read about Europeans and Christians being enslaved, and you may not get a number, but the chronicles will write a vast amount of Christians were enslaved and hauled off and taken to North Africa or the Middle East, etc., etc. And that's habitual, and that goes on all throughout in the not the BC times. If we're talking about Islam, at the Battle of Tours in 732, right before that, we get records of constant enslavement of Europeans in Spain, of course, and into France, and all throughout the Mediterranean. So there's copious records wherever you look. As late as, I believe, the 16th century, you have records of Muslims from Barbary going as far as Iceland. Okay, that's pretty far to get Christian white slaves and bring them back to Africa where they were sold. As far as our other question, you tell me which white man was told, we're going to steal your wives, we're going to rape your wives. That also happened a lot. And we know that because if you look along with all the slaves, of course, women were there, but you also find records. It goes all the way back to Muhammad, where when he was, before the Tabuk campaign, he was trying to rile up his men, his followers, to go and fight and attack the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. And he says, do you not want the women of the Banu al-Asfar? Banu al-Asfar literally means a people of yellow. And historians and linguists have tried to understand what that means. Most think it means light-haired people, fair or fair-skinned, the pale people. But it's there. And also, just throughout this, if you look at my books, I have a lot of quotations, Sword and Scimitar, Defenders of the West. You'll read about Muslims and Mongols and so forth and how they coveted European women for their harems and as slaves. So, to answer her question, yes, white women were raped by non-whites as slaves and concubines. So, in short, and to answer her questions, yes, white people have been enslaved, including by non-whites, many millions throughout history. Now, the problem with the fake history that she's operating under, and which is so widespread and entrenched, the idea that the only people who ever enslaved anyone are white people, and they enslaved black people. The problem with that, well, there's many problems, but one of them, which we can look at right now, the dangers of fake history, which I like to talk about, is the white people who were enslaved by the various peoples, the Mongols and the Muslims and the Berbers, etc., never got reparations. They were never given DEI or affirmative action, and they managed to rise above it. Other people too, not just whites. Other people who have been enslaved, non-whites, who were enslaved by non-whites or whites, were able to rise above it through sheer will, determination, hard work, perseverance. That's the way of the world. It's not about freebies. That's not what helps you develop these good traits to have, perseverance. But if you think the only way that you can achieve some sort of equality is always by freebies and handouts, which essentially is what DEI is, then you will never cultivate these virtues, perseverance and hard work and rising above the negative things that I want to say you, but no, your ancestors have been through slavery, which again, all of us, trust me, our ancestors somewhere down the line have been enslaved, certainly by our understanding of the word enslavement. So if you think the only way to rise above it is to get freebies, that will always keep you, in a way, a perpetual slave who's never able to break the mold and rise above it all. All right, so there's the answer to Ms. Crockett's burning questions. Bye.